So my talk's a bit unusual today in that I probably spend more time talking about what I haven't done yet rather than what I've actually done. And that's because by some absolute miracle, a few weeks ago I found out that the European Research Council is going to fund a very big project on Irish diet. So this is going to be a €1.5 million project over 5 years that would bring together, hopefully, historians, archaeologists and scientists across the UK and Ireland for the first very detailed study of diet in pre-modern Ireland. So I thought this would be a very good opportunity to introduce that project and tell you, I suppose, what some of the ideas behind it were, what we hope to do and achieve, and then you can all tell me it's mad and completely unfeasible, and I'll go back to the drawing board. But food history is a relatively new and very exciting field of history with, I think, potential to transform how we understand the past. So historians globally, and this is just a very small sample of recent historiography on food in the UK and in Europe, historians are really starting to understand that examining what people ate, but also the ideas and the behaviours that they develop around food is a very powerful way to understand past and, of course, present societies. So a massive proliferation of work, in particular in relation to the 16th and 17th centuries elsewhere, but not, unfortunately, in Ireland as of yet. So the project I want to introduce today also focuses on this period, on the 16th and 17th centuries, which really was quite a transformative period in European history, and one where we can see people become conscious, probably for the first time, of their distinct national, for example, and social food identities. So the project then considers key big changes in European society and European politics. So things like big social and cultural transformations, globalization, religious reformation, print culture, humanist ideas, colonization, and how these impacted, first of all, on what people ate, but also on how they identified and interacted through food. And the focus, of course, is on Ireland, where food really did have very deep and complex significance in this period. So as you know, and you've probably just heard about this from David, but between 1550 and 1650, which are the parameters we're using here, successive waves of immigration from Europe, so from continental Europe, from Scotland, from Wales, from France, the Netherlands, driven by religious exile, driven by colonization, driven, of course, by trade, absolutely transformed the demography of Ireland and the infrastructure of Ireland. And this all led to unprecedented intercultural contact, radically different settlement patterns, and very complex processes of acculturation that still define Irish society today. But I think, despite all of the ink that's been spilled on the politics of this period of conquest and colonization, we still know almost nothing about the fundamentals of everyday life in Ireland, and in particular with regards to natives or settlers. And food, as we all know, I'm sure everybody has seen this, probably the only image that survives of Irish people eating in this period. But food really did matter in this context. So food, or the very poor eating habits of the Irish, all of this was used as a reason for justifying colonization. Food distinguished different ethnic communities in Ireland, and food, of course, underscored power struggles. English national food ideologies, which we have to say are resurging today in light of Brexit, these ideas were formed in opposition to the uncivilized manners of the Gaelic Irish and their customs. And ideas around food that were developed in Ireland later went on in other colonial contexts to define settler and native relationships. So Ireland then, at least this is how I sold it to Brussels, Ireland is a really interesting case study for understanding, I suppose, what food means in a complex or contested society. And there is a second objective here, and that is, of course, to change Irish self-perceptions in relation to food. So Irish food history, and I'm very hesitant to say anything about famine, but Irish food history is quite narrowly understood. We, of course, should study famine, but we also have to remember that there are other food stories that we haven't yet explored because of our focus on famine. So I think if we start to explore food in the context of some of the new work that's coming out in other contexts, maybe by looking at a fresh view of Irish food, we can sort of open a dynamic new chapter in Irish history. So this isn't just about colonization. This is about putting Irish food in the context of other changes. So gender, social class, globalization, all these other contexts as well. Now, food is obviously a very, very challenging subject for historians. How do we study something so all-encompassing but so ephemeral? Once you eat it, it's gone. How do you actually study what people ate? And there hasn't really been a good answer to this question yet. So trying to reconstruct what people actually ate. We've got lots of descriptions of what the English thought Irish people ate, for example, but what did people actually eat? This is quite a challenge for historians. And certainly in Ireland, this hasn't been helped by the destruction of the National Archives. So we face greater challenges here than in other countries. Meanwhile, as we all know, that the recent explosion of excavations means that there's now a wealth of archaeological evidence for diet, a wealth of physical evidence and archaeological data, either gathering dust in museum storage or buried in archaeological reports. When studies of diet do occur, they tend to be quite reactive or quite ad hoc. So I'm sure, again, we all know lots of these very high-profile archaeological finds of late. The huge amount of excavation activity in Dublin alone in the last 3 years has led to 16th and 17th century finds like this. So the malnourished Tudor commoners found at Trinity College, Dublin, a hoard of 17th century domestic artefacts at Rathfarnham Castle, and the remains, very exciting, the remains of an apothecary's shop dated to the 1640s, again found in Dublin. But the problem is that the analysis of these kinds of finds is really sort of being drip-fed to the public and to the academic community as they emerge. There hasn't really been an effort to put them all in context. So because we find two malnourished Tudor commoners, we think all the poor starved in 16th century Ireland. It's much more complex than this. So we need to put these finds, very exciting finds, in some context. The other problem is that when archaeologists do approach food, they tend to either look at animal bones or plant remains or pottery shards, but there's never really an effort to bring all these together, and certainly not in the context of the historical documents as well. And this is largely because archaeologists tend to focus on prehistory. So the early modern period is really neglected in terms of diet. One of my archaeological colleagues put it that it's too late to be of any interest to archaeologists. We assume we know everything about this period already, but we don't really. And as a result, we tend to know more about what Neolithic people ate at the moment than what people 500 years ago did. So, and linked to this, new scientific techniques, the really cutting-edge stuff that people are doing elsewhere, tends to be applied in Ireland to the Neolithic or to prehistory, and not to the historic period where it could actually be of incredible value in terms of interpreting all of this material. So the project then obviously wants to transform all of these challenges into opportunities and to bring together the historical documents, the science and the archaeology, I think, to really revolutionize how we understand diet and food culture in this period. So, and again, this is how I sold it to Brussels. This isn't just about Ireland, it's about developing a model really for studying food, or to see if we can develop a model for studying pre-modern diets at a very detailed level. So by way of some background, I suppose it would be good to share some of my own findings from recent attempts to try and approach diet from a historical perspective. So that, I suppose, will help, first of all, to challenge the idea that we can't look at diet in any detail, but also show you the severe limitations that we face as historians if we do, and why then there's a need to try and join forces with other disciplines to make any sense of all of this. So I've been working on diet for quite some time. I started to think about diet when I worked on trade, Irish overseas trade in the 16th century, and that's quite a while ago now. The results of that work is published in these two books here. But the headline story, so this was basically a very big project that looked at Ireland's overseas trade in the 16th century based on the Bristol trade records, which are just by fluke incredibly detailed. And the headline figure, and I suppose the interesting thing about these was that over the course of the 16th century, Ireland, or parts of Ireland, witnessed really quite a considerable consumer boom. So at the very, very beginning of the century, you find about 60 different things turning up over and over again in the customs accounts. By the end of the 16th century, it's almost 400 different things. And we can track when these changes start to happen by counting things, basically. And this was quite exciting because the further we got chronologically through the accounts, the more things we started to find. Not all of these are food related, but quite a lot of them are. So we start to find things like rice, currants, tobacco, hops, all these things coming into the ports. And we also start to find diversification of things. So where before there was one type of knife, by the end of the 16th century there's 10 or 15 types of knives, and drinking glasses and earthenware. So much more commodification, much more variety at the end of the century. And then the introduction of new things, so luxury things like sugar, for example, that didn't exist before then either. Two major trends worth pointing out here. First of all, and this is tricky, but if the map on the left just shows you everything that comes in terms of value into the southeast of Ireland, the map on the right tries to establish where these things might have been going based on the merchant domicile, so the town, the residence of the merchant. And I think what's interesting about this is that you can see that goods, so it breaks down what's coming into Waterford. You can see these new consumer goods are being quite widely diffused around Ireland. So things coming into the southeastern ports could penetrate quite far inland. So I think this does suggest that consumer tastes, despite the very fragmented nature of Ireland in this period, were experienced well beyond the towns of most English influence in Ireland. So despite the regionalised nature of Irish society, there is evidence of a shared and evolving food culture in this period. The second point is that this is not driven purely by colonisation, because we like that narrative. Every time we see change in Ireland, we think the English did it. They introduced us to all these luxury goods. It wasn't for Irish consumption. I think we can see quite clearly in terms of the chronology that there's a lot of change before the Munster plantation here. So from the middle of the 16th century, a massive change in the 1570s. Once the Munster plantation collapses at the end of in the 1600s, consumption doesn't really change. So it doesn't necessarily map onto periods of plantation either. And again, we can't quantify what's coming into Ireland outside of the English records, but we can look at other examples. So for example, the High Court of Admiralty records show us again things that are put on a ship for Ireland. And this also includes lots of luxury things. So we can find Cork merchants in Middelburg lading Dutch ovens and Damascus diaper tablecloths and suckets and sweets and all kinds of new luxury foods to bring to Ireland. And we find stuff coming from Portugal, for example, directly as well, often well before it turns up in the Anglo-Irish trade too. Now, the problem with all of this is it does show us that there's change and it's worth investigating the change, but they're port books, so they tell us what someone put in a ship that was intended to go to Ireland. If it ever got to Ireland, or what happened to it once it got to Ireland, did anybody actually want it? We've no idea. And of course, the things that I've mentioned, these are luxuries, aren't they? You know, sugar and rice, things that people probably didn't have much use for in everyday life. So it's a very dynamic picture, but as a historical record, it's severely limited in terms of what we can look at. We know nothing about the staples of everyday life really from this type of source. So with this problem in mind, for the past couple of years, I've turned my attention to household accounts to get a different window on what people were eating and drinking in this period. Now, this opens a very different window on consumption. Quite interesting because you can look at trends in terms of what people are doing at different times during the year and so on. So I'm going to show some highlights from some of these household accounts. And these are from Dublin Castle. Everybody ate the same as the Lord Deputy in Ireland in the 16th century. That's the first problem, isn't it, with household accounts? But they're interesting nonetheless, so I'll show you some of the highlights from these. Again, it's a very dynamic picture. The elites, as you can imagine, in Dublin Castle ate very well. So diet really it's like an encyclopedia of birds and fish in this period. So, for example, in the 1570s, the cook cooked bitterns, bullfinches, blackbirds. You can imagine how they were cooked. Cranes, curlews, godwits, goose, gull, heath hen, heronshaw, lark, mallard, mew, partridge, plover, quail, redshank, sea pie, sea swallow. I had a student do all of these pictures. Snipe, sparrow, stint, stock dove, swan, teal, turkey. Very interesting because they were purchased on the market. You can see up there turkeys and how much they paid for them in this period as well. Water hens, widgeons, and woodcock. And there was indigestion, presumably after all of that. And an even greater range of seafood as well. But of course, I don't know if you can see this, but this is elite food. People didn't eat like this. Not even the elites probably ate like this every day. And it's fascinating, not just from a consumption point of view, but also from an environmental history point of view. But just like the artichokes and the pineapples and all these things, this is definitely at the top end of society. For most people living and working at Dublin Castle, diet was much more monotonous and mundane as it was in society more broadly. And this is what you get when you break down, when you look at trends in terms of the relative consumption of different types of food in these records in this period. So I'm going to show you a breakdown for 3 years, quantifying everything that's eaten in terms of meat, fish, and dairy in this period. So this is what we get for 1570. If you look at the proportions of meat, dairy, and fish consumed, you can see that beef accounts for a whopping 56% of consumption, with mutton and lamb making up another 19%. So basically, excluding bread and beer, a staggering 87% of diet here is made up of red meat alone. And it's interesting because it's double. It's almost double what we would find at a great household in an English context in this period, where red meat was about 45% in total. So these are quite thought-provoking trends. And again, it's not a blip. This is 1573. It's less dramatic, but 75% of consumption. And shooting forward to 1590, an even larger proportion of beef relative to other meats. So again, about 80% of consumption is red meat. And again, when we think about how we can analyze these sorts of trends to uncover the meaning of food in this complex sort of society, it's probably relevant that far more beef is taken or received as a political gift in this period from Gaelic lords in acknowledgement of their chiefry than is purchased on the open market. So about a third in total of the beef in this account is taken as a gift or as a tax or as a tithe from the Gaelic Irish. So this does suggest that consumption is directly influenced by the political situation in late 16th century Ireland. Outside of meat, the remaining diet was about 25%. The remaining 25% domestic fowl, large quantities of wild fowl, and preserved and fresh fish. Dairy produce is consumed, but in tiny quantities. But that changes quite dramatically at the end of the century. And vegetables are there's none sort of in the 1570s. But again, that changes. There's change even in 20 years towards the end of the 16th century. Now, what's really, really interesting about these is that you can look at seasonal variations in terms of what people eat. So you can see here that this is carcasses of meat, not edible pounds. So you can see here that even in an elite household, diet is very much driven by the seasons in the 16th century. It's not evenly spread throughout the year. So food consumption follows this annual routine that's affected by seasonal variations, first of all, with regards to what food is available in this period, but also by cultural norms that dictate when you should and shouldn't eat certain types of food. This is really interesting because it's a mirror image of the trends found by Christopher Dyer for medieval England. So it's exactly the same types of patterns of consumption that we can see here. So, for example, fresh beef peaks in consumption in December and January. It's replaced by salted beef through the spring and into the summer. Lamb peaks in March, rabbits in midwinter, and fresh pork seems to have been avoided entirely in the summer when people thought it was too risky for your health to eat it. So seasonal variations, but also cultural conventions that dictate what you should and shouldn't eat. The most important of these, of course, are religious restrictions on what you should eat in this period. So as you know, in the medieval period, the church prescribes not just Lent, but also the 6 weeks before the 6 weeks before Easter, but also 3 fish days a week, and that were periods of abstinence where you weren't supposed to eat any meat at all. And the religious Reformation could have removed these restrictions, but the English government reimposed them over and over again by royal proclamation. So you weren't supposed to fast for your soul anymore. It was for the moral good, to prevent people from being greedy, to preserve the navy, and to protect the fishing industry, and so on. Historians elsewhere have really struggled to find evidence of whether people actually ate fish or observed the Lenten fast after the religious Reformation. I think the answer is really clear in this context. So you can see there that beef almost completely disappears off the menu during Lent. The consumption of lamb, which was an elite food, is almost exclusively associated with Lent. So there's 275 lambs consumed alone in March. But what's very interesting, and I know this and a paper on fish isn't there after this, but this is really clear, isn't it? You can see here in March, this is preserved fish, the red line. So you can see that the consumption of preserved fish is absolutely peaks during Lent. So what seems to be happening here is that the elites are salted beef is resisted. The elites are instead switching to lamb and expensive fresh fish, and the servants and labourers and so on are existing as they always did on horrible red herring or herring for the whole of the Lenten season. So again, if we think about what food means in this context, in a period of religious change, what you eat becomes less about your spiritual observance and more about distinguishing the diets of different social classes in this period as well. There's some very interesting trends in terms of alcohol consumption, which I'm sure is much more interesting than beef. Drinking in this period also varied with the seasons. I thought I'd just have a look and see what happens. The green line really does play ball, so you can see that drinking just increases steadily over the course of the summer, and then when it gets to August, people are drinking lots more than they were otherwise. I don't know what happens with the orange one. It's a blip, I think, but you can see alcohol consumption just goes up as it gets warmer, presumably, in this period. We can also say that ordinary beer is definitely the drink of choice or the everyday beverage for people living at Dublin Castle and at other institutions in this period. So ordinary beer and strong beer are produced, but overwhelmingly this is what's mostly consumed by the servants and the labourers and so on. We can even establish relatively how much grain is used in the Dublin Castle beer versus English beers in other contexts. So we even know how much grain goes into each gallon of beer. That's how detailed these records are. And you can see Fitzwilliam was Lord Deputy in this account. He's quite stingy compared to other people producing beer. So his ordinary beer is really only about the same strength as William Harrison's beer, who described his beer as a beer for poor people. So quite low in terms of grain content and so on. We can also, this is from Christchurch Cathedral, the records that the proctor kept there. This one allows us to look at the components of beer. So you can see that Dublin beers, at least in this period, were almost overwhelmingly comprised of oats, which again is very interesting. And that varies with the seasons. Hello. That varies with the seasons as well. Probably She heard meat, yeah. Or I think she heard beer. Yeah, so these beers would probably be more akin to maybe Scottish or Scandinavian, Northern European beers in this period, rather than what's being produced in England at the same time. In terms of how much people drank, we can get a rough estimate at Dublin Castle by looking at how many messes of food were served and how many hogsheads of beer were consumed at the same time. It's around 5 to 8 pints of beer a day in Dublin Castle. The proctor at Christchurch, we can get a much clearer idea of individual consumption, gave the stonemasons up to 14 pints of beer a day. And they used that to wash down a diet of salt beef, eggs, fish, butter, beans and scallions. But it's quite clear that in this context, beer is a fuel. It's calories for very, very heavy manual labor. So that's not typical consumption. But that's indisputable. There's very, very high volumes of alcohol consumed in this period. So I tell you all this by way of showing you that actually, yes, we can develop quite an interesting picture of diet, but one again with severe limitations. So what we end up with is either an incredibly broad picture of what's coming in, but not really any idea of what's happening to it, or else we can zoom in and look at it at a household account level, and then we know what's happening at probably very atypical institutions, very detailed but quite atypical and not necessarily beyond those. Most Irish people didn't keep, unfortunately, records of what they ate and drank. So that's the problem. That's how far we can get if we just look at historical documents. So the question then is, how can integrating science and archaeology help us to fill this picture out a bit? And this is kind of an overview of what we're hoping to do with this project. So it shows you all the little mini projects within the big project. So this is what we describe as a multi-scale interdisciplinary approach. So we want to look at all levels of consumption. And we want to do it using different approaches, not just history. So the first thing we're going to do, we have technologists and an archaeologist that we based at UCD, and they're going to map the archaeology. So go through thousands and thousands of archaeological reports, looking at evidence across all kinds of different sites, so urban, domestic, garden assemblages, and so on, dated to roughly within our period. So the grains, the seeds, the animal bones, the pottery, the human bones, and put all of this data into a database so that for the first time we can search, we can look for statistics or patterns in terms of what's being consumed in different places. So if, for example, you want to know, did people drink hopped beer everywhere, or is this just in an urban context, we might be able to look at those kinds of trends. Did oats really just predominate in one part of the country, or is this everywhere? In what context do people eat more dairy or more meat products? Where does the imported pottery go? These kinds of questions. We hope we'll be able to get a clearer picture through this database. If we link this back to the records then, mapping the archaeology, we hope will allow us to look at the spread of the overseas trade a bit better. So where this stuff is going when it comes into the ports. But also open a window on the vast undocumented trade, the stuff that was strictly off books, which is most stuff, isn't it, that never makes it into any kind of official record. We also want to try and use the archaeology to overcome the limitations. So then we can maybe see how typical the trends that we find in the accounts are in a broader context. And we also hope that integrating archaeological approaches will also help us interpret some of the more puzzling findings in these records. So, for example, we might know that people drank 14 pints of beer a day, but what does that actually mean in this context? What's the nutritional or the social significance? Is everybody drunk all of the time? Probably not. But we're going to engage in some experimental brewing to see if we can reproduce. That did raise some eyebrows in Brussels as well, but yes, we're going to try and reproduce some beer and see what we come up with. And again, the nice pie charts I showed you of meat versus dairy consumption versus fish, all of those are based on the size of a Scottish cow at the moment, because we don't even have metrics for the average size of an Irish cow. So again, we need to do all of this groundwork before we can really make sense of the documents. So we have a zooarchaeological input to try and establish meat weights and dairy production and so on from the size of bones in this period. So by combining then the experimental archaeology and the zooarchaeology, we're going to try and make more sense of the historical records. Then once we've mapped all of these, all of the archaeology, we're going to basically choose some case studies that we then put to much deeper investigation. So again, it's a very big picture, but we're looking at comparative sites. These are some that we've identified as being of interest. What we want to do is try and compare consumption in different contexts. So what does urban versus rural, ecclesiastical versus secular, coastal versus inland, native versus settler, can we try and choose sites that we can look at a more detailed picture comparatively? And the first scientific test we're going to use in this regard is organic residue analysis. And I'm going to give you the ladybird version because I'm not a scientist, so I do find it hard to understand what we're doing sometimes myself. But we're going to look at, so basically organic residue analysis involves looking at the absorbed residues on pottery shards and chemically analyzing those. And it's a technique, again, most often used for exploring ancient consumption, so looking at what's been stored and processed in ancient vessels. In Ireland, this is still quite a new approach, but there's been some really excellent work done recently for the Neolithic period, again, by Jessica Smith, who had the Shard project, which is very, very, very interesting. So we know it can be done. And again, that was a very interesting period of change as well. So it's of interest. We want to see what happens if you take it out of prehistory and use it where we've got documentary contextual evidence as well. So it's very, very interesting to try and use it in a historical context. It should work quite well because there's lots of pottery in Ireland, lots of newly excavated pottery, in contrast to the prehistoric period. And we can date it quite accurately, chronologically, so often to the decade. So we should get some very interesting results from this. Again, as a scientific technique, it's very well placed to address some of the key questions pertinent to this period. So, for example, in terms of food production and consumption, organic residue analysis makes it possible to look, for example, at the relative consumption of meat, fish, and dairy products across different regions and in different types of contexts. So, for example, I've pointed out an incredibly high consumption of red meat at Dublin Castle. It's generally assumed that the Gaelic Irish, in contrast to this, didn't eat meat or very, very little meat. That Irish consumption is different, so that the pastoral nature of the Irish economy, which had led to an emphasis on dairy, meant that meat wasn't eaten much in a Gaelic Irish context. And that in England and throughout Europe, dairy consumption was traditionally associated with the lower classes. And Gaelic patterns of consumption, and this is well documented, Gaelic consumption and their relationship with their cows was viewed as very barbarous and very uncivil in an English context. Recent animal bone analysis by Fiona Beglin, who will be working on this project, has started to really question the simplicity of this narrative. This English-Irish dichotomy. So again, this is a question that we might be able to answer more clearly if we look at what's being cooked and stored and so on in 16th century vessels. So again, we look at the more complex contexts for this kind of consumption. The other reason for deploying this technique is, again, to understand trade and globalization a bit more. So through the detection of molecules, so molecular markers for exotic goods, so things like resins that turn up on these pottery shards, we can again look in a different way at this overseas trade. So we can use them to identify trade networks that we might miss through the documentary evidence, to look at the diffusion of these new tastes and so on throughout Ireland. So again, this will help us to test this idea that actually there was a lot of change happening in the 16th century. So in other words, and again, by looking at how these things are used, so we have this evidence that people are buying more pots different types of pots, specialized things for different items. Again, all of this is evidence of a consumer culture, this commodification of vessels. So if we look at what people are doing with their vessels, what they're storing, what they're cooking, that will help us to build a better picture of that as well. The second approach is isotope analysis of human teeth and bone. So collectively, until we get down here, all of our efforts are still developing a very generalized picture of consumption. So what happens at a macro level, either coming into a port or at the level of individual household. Even when we look at this picture, aside from the proctors, drunken stonemasons, we still don't really get a picture of individual consumption. So it's very hard to work out what individual people consumed. So this is where we're going to analyze human remains to see if we can develop a better picture. So, and this is really, really a simplistic version of what this entails, but Janet Montgomery at Durham will be undertaking this part of the project. And she's done a lot of work, including work on famine victims in Ireland using this technique. So basically when you're alive, you build your body from the food that you consume locally. Stable isotopes stay in your bones when you're buried. Scientists have been doing some really fancy work on using these stable isotopes to work out things like the environment people lived in, their experiences, their mobility, and of course what they ate in this period. Over the past 30 years, this has become quite a well-known archaeological tool in the reconstruction of diets. But again, mostly prehistoric diets with a few exceptions. So measuring strontium and oxygen isotopes allows us to look at the geological origins of people. So at a given site, if we can find enough skeletal material, we should be able to establish patterns of how people lived. So are they local to where they're buried? Are there incomers as well? Then measuring carbon isotopes can show the difference between different types of plants consumed by those people when they were alive, and nitrogen, the amount of meat versus plant. So did they consume more grains to meat in different sorts of contexts? And we can also look at fish versus meat proteins. So again, this would be a good indicator of whether they ate more seafood or meat in a different context. If you just track that back to the comments on the religious Reformation, you can see how that might be useful in terms of estimating religious identity in food. And we can test these incrementally. So because we'll use teeth, hopefully, teeth don't break down basically. So if you measure different teeth formed at different stages of someone's life, you can look at how their diet changes over time. And there's even been some work where you can look at seasonal annual variations in people's diet. So what we want to do is see what we get when we try and apply that to this period as well. So again, there's been some use of this on the famine, but not either prehistory or famine, but nothing really in between, and certainly not in an Irish context. And we're hoping that this might shed light on other famines. So the 16th century famines, which were incredibly extreme, we've got no evidence of how that impacted on society. We might be able to find evidence of that. We should be able to find evidence of differences in diet between incomers and natives, and that would be very interesting in this context as well. So the idea is, by looking at consumption at a micro level, we'll be able to fill these huge gaps in our historical record. And hopefully, by developing a picture of what people actually ate, as detailed as we can get it, then we'll have a framework, finally, for thinking about what food meant in this kind of context. Then we can go back to the descriptions of Irish diet and see, well, is this fake news or is this real? Is this how people really ate? What's propaganda? What's real diet, and so on? And we can reinterpret these descriptions of Irish diet using the literary material and so on. So what we're hoping then, I suppose, overall, is to be able to establish what people ate, what was the ideological basis for what they ate, and to set this in a broader context. So yes, colonization and the impact of colonization, but what else? And I think that is I did mention scallions, didn't I, earlier? The stonemasons at Dublin Castle ate scallions, which seemed really, really specific when I came across that, and beans and peas. And we might think that's just random. It's whatever was around. These are Italian paintings from the same period. And if you understand humoral theory and how people understood the body in this period, you'll know that scallions are very, very much associated with men and with the labouring classes. They're seen as a very suitable food for lower class men to consume when they're undertaking hard work. There's also some very rude connotations about the behaviour of lower class men, which is why he's putting them in his ear, or there's an ear reference there. But these were foods that were known throughout Europe. This isn't just Ireland, that were quite distinct to a particular class and a particular occupation. So what we want to do is really set the Irish experience in a much broader context. Look at these ideas. How do they influence diet? As well as thinking about the English-Irish relationship and so on. This is the team. So Mariel McClatchy at UCD, Janet Montgomery at Durham, Fiona Beglin at Sligo, and Julie Dunn in Bristol. We'll all collaborate to bring these other disciplines together. And we will be employing 3 postdoctoral researchers for the first 3 years to work on this with us as well. And we're hoping overall that this will really improve our understanding of diet at a complex level. Maybe just help us get rid of some of the assumptions that we've built up about what people eat. Someone asked me the other day, will you know what the typical Irish diet is? And the whole point of this is that there is no typical diet. We want to know what things impact on what people eat. We're hoping that this will be of relevance well beyond Ireland. This is just a model, hopefully, for further investigation. And we're also hoping that it will have impact beyond academia. So we're hoping, for example, to feed a lot of this research to Dublin Castle, and we're hoping that will then inform their tours or how they share this information with the public. So we're hoping this isn't just an academic project, but it would be of relevance well beyond academia. And finally, we're hoping that this will lead to a new narrative of Irish food. So to show maybe once and for all the value of moving the study of Irish diet beyond the potato. Thank you.